Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When my mom passed, I thought the worst was over. But then I found out she'd rewritten her will, cutting me out completely. My brother, who was now the sole heir, insisted we should split things fairly. Sounds noble, right? Except he's the one who convinced her to cut me out in the first place. And that's just the beginning of the story. It all started at the reading of my mom's will. I hadn't expected any surprises. My mom had always been clear about her intentions. She wanted everything split equally between me and my brother. Over the years, we'd had conversations about it, and while I never fixated on what I'd inherit, I appreciated her fairness. She'd even joked about how dividing things equally would keep the peace between us. So, when I walked into the lawyer's office that morning, I felt no anxiety, no need to brace myself for bad news. The lawyer, a stoic man in his 50s, greeted us and got straight to business. As he read the will, I quickly realized something was very wrong. The house, the savings, the personal belongings, everything had been left to my brother. Not just a larger share, or some key items. Everything. My name wasn't mentioned once. My heart started pounding as I tried to process what I was hearing. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Are you sure? I interrupted, my voice shaking. The lawyer paused, adjusting his glasses as if to emphasize the legitimacy of his words. Yes, he said calmly, flipping to another page. This will supersedes all previous versions and is the most recent document on file. I turned to my brother, expecting him to look as shocked as I felt, but he just sat there, stone-faced, staring at the table. He didn't meet my eyes or say a word. I could feel the tension rising in the room, the weight of everything I didn't yet understand pressing down on me. The lawyer continued reading, but I didn't hear. My mind was spinning. How could this have happened? My mom had always been so fair, so thoughtful about making sure we were both treated equally. This wasn't like her at all. When the meeting finally ended, I was too stunned to say anything. I lingered awkwardly as the lawyer gathered his papers, hoping my brother would say something, anything, to acknowledge how bizarre this all was. Instead, he turned to me with an almost casual expression and said, "Don't worry, we'll figure something out. I think we should split things fairly, like Mom would have wanted." His words felt like a slap. Like Mom would have wanted? I repeated, barely able to keep my voice steady. She wrote me out of the will, and you're saying we should split things fairly? What does that even mean? He shrugged, his tone maddeningly calm. It means we'll talk. I don't want you to feel left out. Let's just sort this out between us. No lawyers or drama. I didn't have the energy to argue with him right then, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. His reaction didn't make sense. Not the calmness, not the sudden generosity, and certainly not the fact that he seemed completely unsurprised by the contents of the will. As I left the office, my thoughts were a jumbled mess of confusion, anger, and sadness. My mom was gone, and instead of mourning her loss, I was being blindsided by something I couldn't even begin to explain. One thing was clear, though. I needed answers. And I wasn't going to stop until I got them. The first few days after the reading of the will were a blur. I alternated between numbness and anger, trying to wrap my head around what had happened. My mom had always been open about her plans for the future, and there was no indication, none, that she ever intended to leave everything to my brother. The last time we talked about it, she'd even laughed and said, "You and your brother will split everything. That way, no one can complain I played favorites." So why the sudden change? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. My mom hadn't been sick for long. Her decline was swift, giving us just a few months to prepare for the inevitable. I'd visited as often as I could, but my brother had always been the one living closer, able to drop by whenever he wanted. At the time, I thought it was a blessing that he could be there for her more often. Now, I was starting to wonder what else had been happening during those visits. I began my search for answers with a family friend, Mrs. Perkins, who had been close to my mom for years. She was hesitant to speak at first, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. But after some coaxing, she finally said, "Your brother was over there a lot toward the end. He told your mom he wanted to help her get everything in order. Paperwork, bills, things like that. That didn't sit well with me. My brother wasn't exactly known for his selflessness, and the idea of him suddenly stepping up as my mom's personal assistant didn't add up." "Did she ever mention changing her will?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mrs. Perkins shook her head. "Not to me, but she did seem worried about something. I just assumed it was about her health or leaving things unfinished." Her words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. What could my mom have been worried about? And why hadn't she mentioned any of this to me? Determined to get to the bottom of it, I started reaching out to other people who'd been close to my mom in her final months. A neighbor told me that my brother had been at the house almost every day, often staying late into the evening. He said he wanted to take the burden off her shoulders, the neighbor said. It seemed sweet at the time, but the more I dug, the more those sweet visits started to feel calculated. My brother had never been one to do something for someone else without expecting something in return. And while he might have been playing the part of the dutiful son, I couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that he'd used that time to influence my mom's decisions. One afternoon, I called my aunt, my mom's sister, hoping she might have some insight. She was more direct than anyone else I'd spoken to. "I don't want to stir the pot," she began, which was never a good sign. "But your brother mentioned a few times that he thought the will should be revised. He said you didn't need anything, and that it made more sense for him to take care of everything." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "He said I didn't need anything?" I asked, my voice tight. "Well, not in so many words," she said quickly. "But he implied it. Said you were doing fine, and that it would just complicate things to split everything equally." I ended the call feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. My brother had been laying the groundwork for this for months, planting seeds of doubt and spinning a narrative where it made sense for him to inherit everything. And the worst part? It seemed like my mom had believed him. As more pieces of the puzzle started falling into place, the picture they painted wasn't pretty. My brother had clearly spent those final months influencing my mom, framing himself as the only one capable of handling her affairs. And somewhere along the way, he'd convinced her to rewrite the will, cutting me out entirely. Part of me wanted to believe there was some logical explanation, some detail I was missing that would make all of this make sense. But deep down, I knew the truth. My brother had manipulated my mom when she was at her most vulnerable, using her declining health and trust in him to get exactly what he wanted. I couldn't stop replaying our last conversation in my head. The way he'd casually said, "We'll figure something out," as if he deserved a medal for offering to share what should have been mine all along. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. If he thought I was going to let this go, he was in for a rude awakening. The idea of tracking down the lawyer who helped my mom rewrite her will made me nervous. Part of me didn't want to hear what he might say. I wasn't sure I was ready to have my worst fears confirmed. But I knew I couldn't let this go. If I wanted to understand how everything had gone so wrong, I needed answers. It took some digging to find the lawyer. He wasn't someone my mom had mentioned before, which struck me as odd. She'd always used the same family attorney for important matters, but this guy was new, someone my brother had apparently recommended. That alone raised red flags. When I finally managed to schedule a meeting with him, I walked into his office with my heart pounding. The lawyer, a man in his 40s with a sharp suit and a carefully measured demeanor, greeted me politely but didn't seem particularly eager to chat. As I explained who I was and why I was there, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, his tone professional but detached. "But I can't disclose client details, especially not about a will that's already been executed." "I'm not asking for every detail," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just need to understand why my mom made this decision. Was she pressured? Did someone influence her?" He glanced at his watch, a subtle but clear sign that he wanted this conversation to end. "I assure you, everything was handled appropriately," he said. "Your mother was clear about her wishes." The words felt like a slap, but I pressed on. "Was my brother involved?" I asked, watching his face closely for any reaction. The lawyer hesitated for a moment, a split second of silence that told me more than I wanted to know. "Your brother was present during some of our meetings," he admitted carefully. "He was very involved in the process." My stomach churned. That was all I needed to hear. I thanked him quickly, barely able to maintain my composure, and left the office feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. As I walked back to my car, my mind raced. My brother hadn't just been involved, he'd orchestrated the entire thing. I had no doubt about it now. He'd spent months positioning himself as the dutiful son, using his proximity to my mom to influence her decisions and ensure he came out on top. I thought about how vulnerable my mom had been in those final months, struggling with her health and trying to make sense of everything she needed to get in order. She trusted my brother to help her, and he'd taken full advantage of that trust. The audacity of it all hit me like a wave. Not only had my brother manipulated our mom into rewriting her will, but now, with everything legally his, he was trying to act like the bigger person by offering to split things fairly. I replayed his words from the day of the will reading, the casual way he'd said, "Like Mom would have wanted." as if he hadn't spent months ensuring that her official wishes excluded me entirely. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my brother sitting across from me at the lawyer's office, his face calm and unreadable while mine crumbled. I thought about all the times I trusted him, all the moments I'd assumed he had our family's best interests at heart. Those assumptions felt laughable now. He hadn't done this for Mom. He'd done it for himself, for the money, for the control, for whatever satisfaction he got from winning at all costs. I didn't know what my next step would be, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. My brother might have manipulated our mom, but he wouldn't manipulate me. The uncomfortable truth was out in the open now, and I was ready to fight. The decision to confront my brother wasn't an easy one. I'd spent days replaying everything I'd learned, trying to figure out the right approach. Part of me wanted to march into his house and demand answers. Another part of me thought I should let it go, save myself the stress and heartbreak of an argument I knew he'd try to downplay. But I couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about the will or the inheritance. It was about the betrayal, the calculated way he'd used my mom's trust to cut me out of her final wishes. I needed to hear him admit it, to see if there was even a shred of remorse beneath his carefully crafted facade. So, I called him. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't sound surprised, just annoyed, like I was interrupting something trivial. "Sure," he said. "Let's meet for coffee. It'll be easier to talk there." When I arrived at the coffee shop, he was already sitting at a corner table, scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up as I approached, giving me a quick nod before taking a sip of his coffee. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What's this about?" I stared at him, stunned by his nonchalance. "You know what this is about," I said, my voice sharp. "The will. Mom cutting me out. You convincing her to rewrite everything." He finally set his phone down, tilting his head like he was trying to figure out if I was serious. "Mom wanted me to have everything," he said simply, his tone so calm it made my blood boil. "She thought I was better equipped to handle it. But look, I don't want to fight about this. I think it's only fair we split things now." "Fair?" I repeated, my voice trembling with anger. "You manipulated her into cutting me out, and now you want credit for being the bigger person? How is that fair?" He shrugged, taking another sip of coffee like we were discussing the weather. "You're being dramatic," he said. "Mom made her choice." The way he dismissed my accusations made me see red. "Don't act like you had nothing to do with this," I snapped. "I've talked to people, Jake. I know you were the one who pushed her to rewrite the will. You spent months planting doubts about me, convincing her that you deserved everything. And now, after getting exactly what you wanted, you're pretending to be generous by offering to split it." Jake didn't even flinch. If anything, he looked bored. "You're reading too much into this," he said. "Mom was sick. She didn't have the energy to deal with complicated plans. She thought it was easier this way. And honestly, she wasn't wrong." "She wasn't wrong?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You're seriously trying to justify this? You manipulated her when she was at her most vulnerable, Jake. You took advantage of her trust." He leaned forward, his expression finally shifting into something colder. "Don't act like you know what she was thinking," he said, his voice low. "You weren't there half the time. I was. I was the one helping her, taking care of things. Maybe she realized I deserved more because I actually showed up." His words hit me like a slap. I wanted to scream at him, to point out that I'd visited as often as I could, balancing work and other responsibilities while still trying to be there for our mom. But I knew he wouldn't care. He'd already decided on the narrative that suited him best, that he was the devoted son and I was the distant, indifferent sibling. "You think this makes you the hero?" I asked, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You think manipulating Mom and cutting me out makes you some kind of savior?" Jake leaned back again, smirking slightly. "I think it makes me practical," he said. "Mom didn't want to leave a mess for us to clean up. And now, thanks to me, there's no mess." I stood up, unable to sit there for another second. "You're unbelievable," I said, grabbing my bag. "If you think I'm going to let you get away with this, you're dead wrong." Jake didn't try to stop me as I walked out, but his parting words stayed with me long after I left. "Do whatever you need to do," he called after me. "But at the end of the day, Mom made her choice. Maybe you should respect it." Respect it? How could I respect a choice that wasn't even hers to begin with? As I drove home, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, I realized one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The confrontation with Jake left me seething, but it also left me with questions. The more I thought about it, the less sense his actions made. If he truly intended to split the inheritance, why go through the trouble of convincing Mom to rewrite her will in the first place? Why take such extreme measures only to offer me a share after the fact? Jake's behavior had always been self-serving, but this felt calculated, even for him. He wasn't the type to act out of the kindness of his heart, and the idea that he was trying to make things right didn't align with what I knew about him. There had to be something else driving him, something he hadn't admitted. I started digging. At first, I wasn't sure where to begin, so I reached out to a few people who might know more about his recent life. A family friend, Mrs. Callahan, was the first to provide a clue. "I'm not one to gossip," she began, which is exactly what people say before they drop a bombshell. "But Jake's been having a tough time. I heard he had to shut down that business of his last year. Something about unpaid debts." Her words sent my mind racing. Jake had started a business a few years back, a small tech company he'd talked about endlessly at family gatherings. He'd acted like it was going to make him a fortune, brushing off any concerns or questions with smug confidence. I hadn't heard much about it recently, but I'd assumed he was just keeping a low profile. Now, it seemed there was a lot more to the story. I dug deeper, calling another mutual acquaintance who worked in finance. They hesitated at first, but eventually said, "Yeah, Jake's been in trouble. Maxed out credit cards, a few personal loans he couldn't pay back. I think he borrowed money from a couple of people who aren't exactly forgiving about late payments." Suddenly, everything clicked. Jake hadn't convinced Mom to rewrite the will because he thought he deserved everything. He'd done it because he needed everything. The inheritance wasn't just a windfall for him, it was a lifeline. The more I learned, the clearer the picture became. Jake had been drowning in debt for years, and with his business failing and creditors breathing down his neck, he'd seen an opportunity to bail himself out. By securing the entire inheritance, he'd have enough to cover his debts and keep his head above water. But there was another layer to his scheme that made my stomach turn. Offering to split the inheritance now wasn't an act of generosity, it was a calculated move. By giving me a share, Jake could offload some of the responsibility, ensuring he wouldn't have to sell the house or liquidate other assets to pay off his debts. It all made sense now. The rewritten will, his insistence that Mom had wanted things this way, and his casual offer to split everything fairly. Jake wasn't being magnanimous, he was protecting himself. I felt a mix of anger and betrayal as the pieces fell into place. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the lies, the manipulation, and the sheer audacity of what he'd done. He'd taken advantage of Mom's trust, rewriting her legacy to serve his own interests. And now, he was trying to use me to clean up the mess he'd created. The realization filled me with a renewed sense of purpose. Jake had spent years taking without consequences, but this time, he wasn't going to get away with it. If he thought I'd roll over and let him use me as a pawn in his scheme, he was sorely mistaken. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about standing up for myself and making sure he faced the consequences of his actions. And I wasn't going to back down. After piecing together Jake's hidden motivations, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. I needed to tell the rest of the family. Maybe they could offer insight, or at the very least, help me understand why Jake had been able to get away with this. I wasn't naive enough to think everyone would take my side, but I hoped they'd at least hear me out. The first call I made was to my cousin Sarah. She and I had always been close, and I knew she'd have a clear perspective. When I explained what had happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the line before she finally said, "That doesn't sound like your mom at all. She loved you both equally. She'd never just cut you out like that." Her words felt like validation, a much-needed confirmation that I wasn't overreacting. "I thought the same thing," I said, my voice heavy with frustration. "But Jake spent months with her, helping her with paperwork. I think he used that time to convince her to change the will." Sarah sighed. "I wouldn't put it past him, but what are you going to do about it?" That question weighed on me as I started reaching out to other relatives. Some, like Sarah, were sympathetic, immediately expressing disbelief that my mom would have made such a drastic decision on her own. "Your mom was always so fair," another cousin said. "There's no way she would have done this unless someone pushed her." But not everyone was on my side. When I called my Aunt Linda, she listened quietly as I explained the situation, then responded with a pointed, "Well, Jake was the one who was there for her at the end. Where were you?" The accusation hit like a slap. "I visited as often as I could," I said, my voice rising defensively. I was balancing work, trying to handle everything from a distance. I didn't know she was even thinking about changing her will. Linda wasn't swayed. "Your mom needed someone there every day, and Jake stepped up. Maybe that's why she left everything to him, because he earned it." Her words stung. But they also made me realize how deeply Jake had embedded himself into our family's narrative. He wasn't just rewriting the will. He was rewriting his role in Mom's final months, framing himself as the dutiful son while I was painted as the absentee sibling. As I continued reaching out, the divide in the family became painfully clear. Some relatives were firmly in my corner, shocked by what had happened and eager to offer their support. Others seemed to side with Jake, either dismissing my concerns or suggesting I was overreacting. "It's just money," one uncle said dismissively. "Why let it tear the family apart?" "It's not just money," I shot back, struggling to keep my composure. "It's about trust. It's about what Jake did to manipulate Mom and take advantage of her when she was vulnerable." The divide was painful to navigate, but it also revealed who I could trust. People like Sarah stood by me, offering advice and encouragement when I needed it most. Others, like Aunt Linda, made it clear that they'd already chosen Jake's side, or, more accurately, the version of events he'd crafted to make himself look like the hero. Through it all, I realized this wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about loyalty, trust, and the cracks in our family that had been there all along but were now impossible to ignore. The conversations left me emotionally drained, but they also strengthened my resolve. Jake's actions had exposed the fractures in our family, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about who we were and how we treated each other. As painful as it was, I knew I couldn't back down. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. It was about standing up for myself and refusing to let Jake's manipulation go unchecked. The family might be divided, but I was determined to fight for the truth. And I wasn't going to stop until everyone saw Jake for who he really was. After weeks of tense silence, Jake started calling me regularly, his tone surprisingly conciliatory at first. He framed the conversations as attempts to work things out, like he was doing me a favor by being reasonable. "We're family," he said in one of the first calls. "We shouldn't let this come between us." But every conversation quickly took on a familiar pattern. He'd start by talking about how much he missed Mom and how hard things had been for him since she passed. Then he'd pivot, subtly suggesting that we needed to resolve the disagreement before it spiraled further. By the end of each call, it was clear he wasn't interested in resolving anything. He just wanted me to drop my objections and go along with his terms. "I'm trying to do the right thing here," he said during one particularly heated call. "Mom would want us to figure this out together. She wouldn't want us fighting like this." His words made my blood boil. "You mean Mom would want me to clean up your mess?" I shot back. "You manipulated her into cutting me out, and now you want me to be the one to fix things? How is that fair?" Jake sighed, the kind of exaggerated, theatrical sigh that made it clear he thought I was the problem. "You're being stubborn," he said. "I've already said I'm willing to share. I didn't have to offer that, you know? I could have kept everything, no questions asked." I couldn't believe his audacity. "You're acting like you're doing me a favor," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "But none of this should have happened in the first place. You've already taken what wasn't yours, and now you're trying to frame yourself as the good guy? Spare me." That was the moment I realized there was no reasoning with him. Jake wasn't looking for a resolution. He was looking for control. By calling me, by framing himself as the peacemaker, he was trying to manipulate me into accepting his terms without question. After that call, I stopped answering his number. The voicemails started piling up, each one dripping with faux concern and thinly veiled guilt trips. "I'm trying to reach out, but you're shutting me out," he said in one message. "Do you really want this to end in court?" "Because I don't. I want us to move on, but I need you to meet me halfway." Meet him halfway? That would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. Jake had already taken everything, and now he was acting like I owed him something for being reasonable. The final straw came when he showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door to find him standing there, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. "We need to talk," he said, pushing his way inside before I could protest. His demeanor shifted quickly once he was inside, turning from casual to defensive. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, pacing my living room. "I'm trying to work with you, but you're being impossible." I crossed my arms, standing my ground. "I'm not the one who made this mess, Jake. You are. And now you're upset because I won't let you control the narrative? Too bad." That set him off. For the first time, his mask of calm cracked, and he let out a bitter laugh. "You think this is all about me?" he said, his voice rising. "You don't understand anything. Do you know how much pressure I was under? How much Mom relied on me at the end? I earned this. I deserve this." His outburst only confirmed what I already knew. Jake had convinced himself that his actions were justified, that his manipulation of Mom was somehow noble because it had helped her in her final months. He didn't see himself as a liar or a thief. He saw himself as a martyr. "Well, good for you," I said, my voice icy. "You got what you wanted. But don't expect me to clean up your mess or pat you on the back for being so generous." He stared at me for a moment, his face a mix of frustration and disbelief, before finally throwing up his hands. "Fine," he said. "Do whatever you want. But don't come crying to me when this all blows up in your face." With that, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. Jake's behavior had always been selfish, but this was something else entirely. He wasn't just trying to justify his actions. He was trying to rewrite reality to make himself the hero. It was the last time I spoke to him directly. From that point on, I decided to focus on what I could control. My own actions, my own truth, and my own fight to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Jake could keep spinning his stories and playing the victim, but I wasn't going to let him drag me down any further. Deciding to contest the will wasn't a decision I made lightly. I'd never been one to seek out conflict, but this wasn't something I could let slide. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle, about standing up to the blatant manipulation and deceit my brother had orchestrated. If I let him get away with this, it would feel like betraying my mom's trust and allowing her legacy to be twisted by his selfishness. I met with a lawyer named Rachel, who specialized in estate disputes. Her office was small but professional, with walls lined with legal books and framed diplomas. I explained everything to her: the rewritten will, Jake's suspicious involvement, and the overwhelming sense that my mom had been manipulated into cutting me out. Rachel listened carefully, occasionally taking notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Contesting a will isn't easy," she said. "The courts tend to honor the deceased's wishes as they're written, so the burden of proof will fall on you. But from what you've told me, there's enough here to raise questions about undue influence." Rachel explained that undue influence occurs when someone pressures or manipulates a person into making decisions that don't reflect their true intentions. "It's not uncommon in cases like this," she said. "If your brother had significant access to your mom during her final months, and if there's evidence that her decision to rewrite the will was inconsistent with her past behavior, we may have a case." Her words gave me hope, but they also made it clear how much work lay ahead. Contesting the will would require gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and proving that my brother had used his proximity to our mom to alter her wishes. It would be a grueling process, both emotionally and financially, but I knew I had to see it through. The first step was gathering documentation. Rachel asked me to pull together any emails, text messages, or letters that might show a pattern of my mom's intentions before the will was rewritten. I spent hours combing through old messages, looking for anything that could support my case. The process was painful. Every email and photo I found reminded me of the person my mom had been before her illness, and every step of the legal fight forced me to relive the heartbreak of losing her. But it also strengthened my resolve. My mom deserved better than to have her final wishes dictated by someone else's greed. One of the most valuable pieces of evidence came from Sarah, my cousin. She kept a series of text messages from my mom, sent months before the will was rewritten, in which my mom talked about wanting everything to be split equally between Jake and me. "It's only fair," she wrote in one message. "I don't want them to fight over this later." Those messages directly contradicted the terms of the new will and added weight to the argument that Jake had influenced her decision. Sarah also agreed to testify if it came to that, saying she couldn't sit by and let Jake's lies go unchecked. Rachel also reached out to people who'd been close to my mom in her final months. Some were hesitant to get involved, but others were willing to share what they'd observed. Mrs. Callahan, the family friend who'd first hinted at Jake's financial troubles, provided a statement about how often he'd been at my mom's house and how he'd insisted on handling her paperwork. "He said he wanted to take the burden off her," she said. But looking back, it seemed like he was more interested in taking control. The evidence started to build, piece by piece, but it wasn't without its challenges. Jake, of course, denied everything, painting himself as the dutiful son who'd simply honored our mom's wishes. His lawyer argued that the will was legitimate, and that any attempt to contest it was nothing more than sour grapes on my part. The legal battle dragged on for months, each step more draining than the last. There were depositions, court filings, and countless meetings with Rachel to prepare for the next round of arguments. Every time I thought we were making progress, Jake's team found a way to stall or deflect, trying to wear me down. But through it all, I refused to give up. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about standing up for myself and my mom. Jake had spent his life avoiding consequences, but I wasn't going to let him escape accountability this time. As the case moved closer to a resolution, Rachel pulled me aside after one particularly grueling meeting. "You're doing the right thing," she said, her voice steady. "This isn't just about winning. It's about making sure the truth comes out. No matter what happens, you've already proven that you're willing to fight for what's right." Her words stayed with me as we prepared for the final stages of the case. Winning wouldn't bring my mom back, and it wouldn't repair the damage Jake had done to our family. But it would prove that I wasn't powerless, and that was worth fighting for. Just when I thought I'd hit a wall, I received a call that changed everything. The number wasn't familiar, but something about it felt important, so I picked up. The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Thompson, an old family friend who'd known my mom for decades. We hadn't spoken in years, but she was one of the people who'd been there for my mom during her illness. "I heard about what's happening," she said gently. "I wasn't sure if I should get involved, but I can't stay quiet anymore." "Your mom wasn't herself toward the end." My chest tightened as I processed her words. "What do you mean?" I asked. She seemed so confused. Mrs. Thompson continued. "Your brother kept saying he was helping her, but it didn't feel right. He was always hovering, always taking over. I didn't want to interfere at the time, but now I think he took advantage of her." Her words hit me hard, both validating and heartbreaking at once. For months, I'd been piecing together how Jake had manipulated my mom, but hearing it confirmed by someone who'd seen it firsthand was like a punch to the gut. "Can you tell me more?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Anything you remember could help." Mrs. Thompson sighed, the sound heavy with regret. "I remember one day when your mom asked me something odd. She said, 'Do you think I'm doing the right thing?' At first, I didn't understand what she meant, but then Jake came in and cut her off, saying, 'Mom, we've talked about this. It's all taken care of.'" He didn't even let her finish. The memory sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just the content of what she'd said. It was the implication that my mom had doubts, that she wasn't entirely on board with the decisions Jake had been pushing her to make. Mrs. Thompson didn't stop there. She described how my mom had become increasingly withdrawn in her final months, often deferring to Jake on matters she would have handled herself before. "It was like she didn't trust her own judgment anymore," she said softly. "I didn't want to believe he was taking advantage of her, but looking back, exactly what was happening." Her testimony became a turning point in my case. Rachel was thrilled when I shared what Mrs. Thompson had told me. "This could be the evidence we need to establish undue influence," she said. "A first-hand account from someone who witnessed your mom's behavior is incredibly powerful." Mrs. Thompson agreed to provide a formal statement and even offered to testify if it came to that. Her support felt like a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in a battle that had often felt overwhelming and isolating. But it wasn't just her testimony that made a difference. It was the reminder that I wasn't alone. For months, it had felt like I was fighting this war on my own, with only a handful of allies like Rachel and Sarah by my side. Mrs. Thompson's willingness to step forward showed me that there were people who saw through Jake's manipulations, people who believed in the truth and were willing to stand up for it. Her involvement also encouraged others to come forward. A former neighbor of my mom's reached out, sharing her observations of Jake's behavior during his frequent visits. "He was always so insistent," she said. "I remember thinking it was strange how much control he seemed to have over your mom's decisions." Each new piece of evidence added to the case, building a narrative that was impossible to ignore. It became clear that my mom's decision to rewrite the will hadn't been entirely her own, that Jake had used her vulnerability and trust to serve his own interests. For the first time, I felt like I had a real chance to set things right. The case wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about restoring my mom's voice, ensuring that her true intentions weren't erased by Jake's schemes. And while the fight was far from over, the encouragement I received from people like Mrs. Thompson reminded me why I'd started this battle in the first place. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for the truth. Their support gave me the strength to keep going, even when the road ahead felt daunting. I wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The legal process was nothing short of exhausting. Months of hearings, filings, and depositions stretched on like an unrelenting storm. Every time I thought we were nearing the end, another motion or piece of evidence would drag things out further. But through it all, I stayed resolute. This wasn't just about reclaiming my share of the inheritance. It was about standing up for myself and for the truth of my mom's intentions. The court proceedings were emotional, bringing up memories of my mom that were both painful and precious. There were moments when I felt like giving up, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of it all. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of why I had started this fight. My mom had trusted Jake, and he'd used that trust to manipulate her. Allowing his actions to stand unchallenged would have felt like betraying her all over again. In the end, the judge ruled partially in my favor. The court found enough evidence of undue influence to invalidate the rewritten will, though the division of assets wasn't entirely equal. I reclaimed a portion of the inheritance, not everything, but enough to feel like justice had been served. The victory felt bittersweet. On one hand, I was relieved to have won, to have proven that my mom's true intentions couldn't be erased by Jake's lies. But on the other hand, the fight had left scars on my family, on my heart, and on my relationship with my brother, which was now beyond repair. Jake didn't take the ruling well. He'd stormed out of the courtroom when the decision was announced, muttering something about me being ungrateful and vindictive. I haven't spoken to him since, and honestly, I'm not sure if I ever will. The rest of the family remains divided. Some relatives supported me throughout the process, understanding why I'd felt compelled to take action. Others sided with Jake, either believing his version of events or simply resenting the disruption the case had caused. Family gatherings are awkward now, when I even bother to attend, but I've made peace with the fact that not everyone will see things the way I do. As I look back on everything that happened, I can't help but wish things had turned out differently. I wish my mom's final months hadn't been clouded by manipulation. I wish Jake had been the brother I'd always wanted him to be, someone I could trust and rely on instead of someone I had to fight against. And I wish our family didn't feel so fractured, so distant from the unity we once pretended to have. But as much as I wish for those things, I also know that the fight taught me lessons I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I learned the importance of standing up for myself, even when it's uncomfortable or unpopular. I learned that justice doesn't always come easily, but it's worth pursuing anyway. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that reveal the deepest truths about who we are and what we're capable of. Do I regret the fight? No. It wasn't about the money. It was about honoring my mom's memory and ensuring that her true intentions were respected. Winning the case didn't erase the pain or bring her back, but it gave me a sense of closure I didn't think was possible. Now, as I move forward, I'm focusing on rebuilding my life. I've reconnected with friends I drifted away from during the legal battle, found joy in small moments, and started to think about the future in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. There's still a void where my relationship with Jake used to be, but I've come to terms with the fact that not all relationships can be salvaged. If standing up for myself makes me the bad guy in his eyes, so be it. I'd rather be the bad guy than someone who lets themselves be walked over. For the first time in what feels like forever, I feel at peace. And while the journey to get here was far from easy, I know it was worth it. Sometimes, moving forward means letting go, not just of the past, but of the people who refuse to meet you halfway. And as hard as that is, it's also liberating. Because now, for the first time, I'm living life on my own terms.